Coming to you from beyond the final frontier, it's Archaeodeath.
Welcome, everybody, to another Archaeodeath interview with myself, Professor Howard Williams, and my special guest. And this week, we're into the world of landscapes, computers that go ping, and all manner of exciting ancient monuments with Lena. Lena, please introduce yourself and welcome.
Hi, Howard. Yes, so I'm Lena Delaney. I don't know, I'm one of Howard's PhD researchers. Is that the word we use?
I don't know. That's the word we have used, so let's do that. Yeah.
And I also have been working in archaeology for like ever, it feels like, to be honest. And at the moment, my current work is I work for Historic England, so la-di-da, working as one of the inspector of ancient monuments, dealing with Kent and East and West Sussex.
Wow. And before we go on, do we have to ask a question? As an inspector, or do you get a little sort of leather thing which you flip open and it's got a badge where you can sort of go, stop everything, I'm an inspector? Or what, do you get any kind of, is there any sort of, no, nothing like that?
There was we had training a few weeks ago about the fact that we are like a prosecuting body. So so we can actually like prosecute people, like it's like the police and us for monuments damage and stuff. But we had to go through a bunch of training about how to do the interview properly, like when you give the caution, when you see them on TV going like you might remain silent and stuff like that. We had training to do that. And and we got a little card to put in my wallet to remind me of exactly what I meant to say if I'm having to give like caution to anyone.
Really
that's the only thing I have, like this little card.
I do think it's a great shame that our many TV and drama series have not included an archaeology version of the bill. I mean, there was the Bone Kickers with that moment where the guy goes, "Excuse me, everyone stop, move away, we're the archaeologists," and it was just so painful. But I really think there should be more. You're nicked, mate.
Get them, they're now detecting the hill. Get up there now. Quick run. I think inspectors used to have an outfit. I've been told this a number of times. They used to have a uniform, like with like stripes on it. I think it was like dark navy with red stripes on the arms and the legs or something. And I'm pretty sure there was a hat as well. I'm pretty sure and that's no longer part of the uniform, but I wouldn't be against it. Like formal wear now and again.
I think we should lobby. This is probably the number one issue facing archaeology in the UK, and it must be dealt with. And already we're into territories I never thought we would get into, but there you are. Now I've got seared into my mind that I must lead a campaign, a social media, extravaganza of strategy to make sure we all have uniforms. That's a bit weird, isn't it? Anyway,
yeah, but you could do like a period TV show as well, like based around the origins of historic England with is it Fox? No, it's not Fox. But like him setting up the Monuments Commission and trying to like protect these things. There's some room for that.
There is. And you have the whole Hollywood film series, Inspector Origins. Anyway, it's great stuff. But it's wonderful that you have so many. Well, you don't have a hat as part of this uniform, but so many metaphorical hats.
Hats.
You wear and you have worn in your journey in the world of archaeology. So may we start with a little bit more of a sense of how you got into archaeology and your kind of everything you've been doing up until you started doing this duality of roles of inspector and doctoral researcher. What happened before then? How did this all happen, Lena?
Honestly, I can tell you the most ridiculous story in the world about how I started archaeology, and it's basically that I would always been involved in film school, and if you ever talk to me, you'll know that film is one of the things I'm kind of obsessive with. I have a podcast about it, also that manner of stuff, and I wanted to go and do film as my university thing. And I applied to Leicester to go do film school there. And I mainly applied to Leicester because this would be embarrassing, but there was a boy I very much liked who was going to Leicester and I wanted to go there with him. and they cancelled film school. I think I was the only person that applied to it. And I was like, but I gotta go to Leicester. That's where he's going. So I looked through the prospectus and I think I got to accounting. No. Archaeology. That sounds quite good.
No, I don't want to hear this. Just stop the interview. Stop the interview now. Right, we're going to redo this, and you're going to say, since the age of 5, I always thought about the garden, and I always wanted to be an archaeologist. No, that we're going to do that. Okay, let's stop the cat. No, okay, no, we'll stick with yours. That's brilliant. So, okay, right, okay. So it was a mixture of but very personal. Yeah.
But it was like I'd always loved history. I'd always been obsessed with history. I like not just like the history we're taught, but like I was raised like by a family that's long like associations with like obsession with the past and like anarchist kind of groups and things like that. So like I grew up like thinking and talking about history with my family. But like the actual kind of academic study of history, I didn't enjoy that much. I didn't like that kind of literature kind of basis of it. And it never even occurred to me that there was a different way of studying the past. It wasn't a thing that you were taught at school, right? It was like, oh, what this could be. And when I saw it in the book, it was like, oh, wait, there's like a way that I can study the past here. There's a way that I can interact with the past and learn about people's lives and learn things about like, I was always been obsessed with that arrow on the timeline, like when it goes, this date happened, then there was an arrow and this date happened. And I was like, well, what's the arrow? I want to know what the arrow is. Like,
yes!
So like, so I've always been kind of obsessed with those little weird kind of voids and areas. And I think being able to take archaeology at like Leicester, that really opened that all up to me. And I started realizing, wait, this is an actual, this is an actual kind of pursuit. This is things I can do. It's not just like a TV film character. So
I think
that really changed everything.
I think that's really important for people to remember that while archaeology's profile over the last 30 years has grown, and we have been around a long time.
Oh yeah.
That I think for many people, and I think it's important we admit that I wasn't sure until I got to looking at universities, whether archaeology was a viable option. I obviously understood that archaeology existed as a discipline, but I didn't understand how it worked or anything. I still don't really. Inspectors, what's that even mean? But I'm still struggling at times to remember what happens in different countries and different organizations. Yeah. And but I think people do think the term history is perhaps a term I prefer. I think we should just colonize it. We should take it over. We're the historians. We're the historians of most of the stuff, because the term history is the default. People who study the past are historians, and I get called a historian when I wear a jacket, and I don't get called an archaeologist when I'm wearing jeans or cargo pants. It's really weird. It's a weird, it's almost. But archaeology is the way to study. Those voids are 99.9% of the human past. Those,
yes, exactly.
Following those arrows, as you put it, and I think that's, it's still people are only now cottoning on to this fact. So I don't think it's some great yawning gap of your knowledge that even though you say you were brought up with a family very conscious of history and thinking about the lessons of history, and yet you still didn't quite know. And I think many people, and I would admit myself, I knew archaeology existed, but I didn't really think about it as a discipline for university until I was probably 16 and a half, 17. Yeah, I think that's true.
And even when I graduated university, I didn't actually really understand it was a job. And that's not really a failing of the education. That's just because it's difficult tying those two things together sometimes. But I graduated and I ended up working in GIS. So for like a council, like doing maps for them, doing databases and stuff like that for them. And one day, like something came across my desk about like an archaeological evaluation that was going on for some housing. And I was like, okay, well, what's this? and I phoned up the county archaeologist that was on this thing in my region. I was like, hi, what's archaeology? Like I've got an archaeological degree. Can I work in this? And he like basically taught me through like what archaeology was as like a commercial sector, like how it fits into planning and stuff like that. So I basically was like, okay, I'm going to do that. Like, I'll do that instead. So I moved on and I eventually did a master's in kind of like applied archaeology and landscape kind of stuff, and then after that I just worked for the University of Birmingham and bounced around doing every single job I could find, really.
Just worked for the University of Birmingham. I mean, this was for you did loads of stuff. You were bouncing all over the world, weren't you?
I was. So I was quite lucky in the fact that my work at the University of Birmingham just ended, and I ended up working in Northampton it was just before they became Molar. And I remember I was living in like a dig house, like 8 other archaeologists, like the kind of ceiling falling in everywhere. And I remember like there was like, I wouldn't say it was next door, but around my area was kind of like the red light district. And I remember there was a lot of raiding, there was a lot of kind of police activity. And I remember one morning I woke up in the middle of the night with sirens like everywhere. And the next day I got an email from someone at the University of Birmingham and was like, "Do you want to go to Qatar and they need someone to do some surveying?" And I was like, yes, I do.
Take me away from Northampton.
Yeah, is it not Northampton? I'll go. That sounds mean to Northampton, but like I worked on a research project for the University of Birmingham with the Qatar Museum Authority for like 5 years, and we were based out of Doha, but we worked to like jobs in like Amman as well, and around the region, and like trying to get works in Abu Dhabi as well and stuff. So we kind of, that whole area, we were doing this project-based work, which was kind of fascinating and kind of along a lot of ways kind of formalized the way I see working with like kind of different communities and how I think about archaeology. I would say.
It must have been an amazing experience. I mean, Northampton must have been an amazing experience. But I've actually Northampton was one of the black holes in my knowledge of the geography of Britain. I've always been through it or not to it, and I've got a friend there now, and I've been a couple of times, and it's a very nice place. There seems to be a lot of Turkish barbers and traffic wardens. That seems most of the town centre seems to be comprised of those two groups, and but apart from that, and it's the only place I've been hit by an e-scooter from behind, and it bounced off me because I'm quite robust in
Welcome
my stride.
to Northampton.
Yeah, but otherwise it's been a nice place. But so I know disrespect, but yes, that experience must have been very different. So what type of projects are we talking about, to give people a bit of a sense of, when you say you're working in Qatar, what kind of project work were you doing?
So it was a very, very wide ranging project. The idea was, technically, we're looking at what were these early movements of people that were kind of associated with the infilling of the Arabian Gulf, like, and can we see if we can identify these pockets of like human activity and settlement as this kind of flood event was happening. The two rivers were flooding and filling up this thing about, I don't know, 16,000 to 8,000 years ago.
Oh, holy, right,
like
so
that.
you go
like,
real back.
far back, like, yeah. And because you have this connection to like Mesopotamia and Iran, you have this old civilization, like with like the Ubaid civilization particularly, and these pockets of activity and what was actually going on there. That was what our project was based around. But we kind of got to Qatar and it was a mess. Like, Qatar was not just a country that was developing incredibly quickly. It was building cities, building railways, building like motorways, building huge new ports and infrastructure. But they'd been a country that had just kind of been raided by colonial archaeologists for the past 100 years, yet they didn't know anything about their history. So like French teams have been over, British teams have been over, German teams have been over, found like, amazing like evidence of Paleolithic activity or different types of flakes or Abbasid kind of like medieval kind of ruins, and then gone home with it and written a paper about it. So like the stuff in the actual country wasn't really very well recorded, and they didn't really just have a grasp on. They were like, we know there's history here, but we don't know where it is. We don't know what it is, because no one's ever kind of told us, and it doesn't kind of come back to us. So really, what my job there became is less to do with like the Ubaid stuff, even though I was involved with like the excavation and the marine project and stuff. But really, I started building a database and building like and using their legislation that existed to kind of start working in a more commercial archaeology kind of aspect to them. So we ended up building them a historic environment record, which is something we have in Britain, and it allowed them to manage not only where the archaeology was found, the papers and the evidence for that, the grey literature or the published journals, and it can manage where the work has been done and where it hasn't been done. So suddenly we could be like, well, we don't need to dig there because we did a survey there 2 years ago, and here's the results of that survey. And this just wasn't something that existed
in the
beforehand.
UK to get all the information,
oh
isn't
God,
it?
yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't say. We've got a wonderful advanced system that.
Yeah, we're perfect.
Yeah. But you're trying to do basically what's taken over 100 years or whatever, 80 years in the UK to do. You're trying to create from scratch.
from scratch there, yeah, and trying really it was giving them a control over their heritage. Like there might be stuff that I disagreed with how they wanted to do it, but that wasn't really the point. Like the point is, how do they want to manage their heritage? One of the first things I ever got when I got there was literally like I got handed survey sheets, and the groups that would go out and to do survey would do things like, I don't know, they'd drive like 40 minutes out of Doha, and the first thing on your survey sheet might be like location, and they'd write Doha, and it's like you're not in Doha. You left, like, and it was very much this idea. It was very like it was kind of this sub-colonial idea that like we're entering this virgin territory that they don't know anything about, and we'll tell them what their heritage is. And actually, when I started working with the local archaeologists, started speaking to like different, you know, departments, every place name was named. Every bump in the kind of country had a name. Like, you know, everything had been located. And so we started being able to kind of tie all that thing up. When I look at the desert, it was like, it's just desert. So there might be one of the thing might be, where were you surveying? It'd be like desert. And it's like, and then you talk to like the Arab archaeologists or the Arabian archaeologists, and they'll be like, oh no, that's a wadi, or that's like a jebel, that's like this different terms. And we were able to bring in their kind of language for like their geomorphology into the sheets we were doing, and that meant we could design the database and design the kind of the way it worked in the way they see their landscape and not the way we see it, which was wrong basically, like, because we didn't have that experience. So it really did define in a lot of ways how I kind of think about working with kind of archaeology now, and I think it's still like that in England in ways. So it was really kind of a strange, useful experience.
So that happened, and then what came next? Because you were then back in the UK doing governmental archaeology. Is that the term? Local government
archaeology. Yeah, I was lucky that I spent like, you know, I jumped off projects and I worked in Estonia for a little bit. I worked in Vietnam for a little bit. Like, so I managed to kind of tie in like different sorts of like projects and see different types of like the way things are working, and then came back to the UK just because eventually when you're working through projects, all the projects run out. Like, so at some point I had no more projects to work on, so I ended up coming back to the UK, and I worked in Herefordshire. And Herefordshire, I started working in their HER. So, and my job was to do the HER, manage the database for the archaeology in Herefordshire, and also to give like countryside advice. So Herefordshire is mainly countryside, but countryside advice would be like, I have this field full of Roman archaeology, and can I plow it, please? And you'd be like, can you not? Like, like actually, or if you do plow it, can you do it like minimum min-till, please? Or I want to plant this new woodland, can I plant it here over this, like, you know, earthwork? And I'm like, no, don't please, but you could plant it here, like that'd be fine. It's that kind of stuff. And I started tying back in that kind of legislative kind of way that archaeology works in our system, not just through strict planning, but in the different kind of laws that we have. And eventually I moved on from Hereford and found a job in Historic England, which is a similar sort of thing, which is Historic England, as I always say, is a bit of a weird job because it's the first time in archaeology I've been working with archaeology where you know where it is. Where normally it's like you get sent to a field to be like, watch this evaluation, and you might find, you know, a few ditches. But now I'm like, there's a castle there that I have to look after. Like, I can see that. So it's that kind of difference in levels.
I mean, there's always stuff associated with those castles we may not know much about, and there's always more, you know. But
it's totally.
It's so exciting because, I mean, I feel such in awe of the things you've been able to do in your career, because I feel very jealous actually, because I think we all do different things and think, I mean, they do things I've never done. And this is the thing about archaeology as a career. There's so much diversity in where, you know, in the landscape, in the types of monument, the type of material culture that you deal with. But but Herefordshire is as good as Wales, really. It's right on the west of England, for those who don't know. It's on the Welsh border. You know, as you say, there are some conurbations of different sizes, but it's mainly countryside. And now you're in the sort of in the horribly south and east type territories, dangerously Londonish, sort of in my mind,
Yeah,
So what type of area are you covering now?
so I cover Kent and East and West Sussex, and
So that's all town. No, it
it's
might not be. No,
like
there's lots of
especially,
but yeah.
and just a lot of infrastructure. That's the difference, really.
Yeah.
I think Kent is quite. I don't want to say it's rural. That's not the right word, but there's a lot of small kind of villages in
Of course.
Kent, but everything's like infrastructure. Like everything's like a big road in Kent. Even when I drive off like the main roads, it still looks like I'm on a giant road. In Herefordshire, you turn off the road and you're on a track that this small,
Yes,
and like
yes,
there's
yes.
hedges everywhere. But in Kent, there's just infrastructure everywhere. There's road signs everywhere. There's stuff everywhere. Like, and I think it just feels a lot more formalized as a landscape rather than Herefordshire still is that kind of like rural kind of like feel to it.
So you have to deal with very different types of monuments.
Absolutely. It's fun because my job really to explain like Inspector of Ancient Monuments is a ridiculous title.
Never.
But there's certain legislation in the country that levels different types of archaeology. So there's non-designated archaeology, which might just be, the stuff that is in a field somewhere that someone once found. Really, it's any heritage. And then there might be some listing protections or local listing that be like, well, this house here is quite important, so we're going to make sure that it's protected from any future development. And then you get like scheduling, the stuff that I deal with, which is this is one of the most important sites in the country and it can't be destroyed. And there's issues with scheduling and what's on the schedule and what isn't on the schedule. Like we always laughed in Herefordshire because when they actually were building the schedule, they got to Herefordshire last, so they'd see like a ton of like earthworks or barrows or like DMVs and be like, well, we got so many of them already. But like Kent is one of the first places where they started. I think the first scheduled monument was in Kent. Like, so you have that kind of history of everything here being protected for a long time, and being recognised for a long time, and it means that it's generally quite visible. So you have stuff like, I don't know, the things I look after, like Dover Castle, or like Roman burial grounds that were found at some point and things like that. A lot of villas. You get a lot of villas down this type of area because the connection to Europe and things.
Living Romans coming over here.
Trading. And you get and so like my job now really is I see it as, I think some people could say like I'm the government kind of body, coming over to yell at people, but really my job is kind of giving a voice to the heritage, because people might own it might be on someone's land, but it's actually the public's heritage. It actually belongs to the nation. It's not, it goes beyond someone's own ownership. So there has to be ways for us to manage it, and it might be, someone's got their house and next door to it there's a Roman or an Iron Age site or something, and their water's broken, so they have to dig some new water pipes. And so it's my job to make sure they can dig water pipes without digging up the archaeology. Or it might be that there was a Roman, I don't know, let's say a little Roman town, at some point a village, in the medieval period expanded into it, and now they want to build more houses around it, and it's going to include this Roman thing. And it's me talking to the developers, me talking to the kind of architects to encourage a way that the archaeology can be subsumed into a project without ruining its importance, without kind of taking away what makes it feel special, or what takes it away from what is clear to the public. There is archaeology there, that makes it special, that you live in a place that you can say that my hill fort's on top of that hill is there, and that means there've been people living here forever, rather than it just being kind of disguised by modern development. It's giving it some kind of space in that landscape.
I love that idea. I think that's a really brilliant framing of the job, is the voice for the archaeology, because some people may not be aware that, of course, Historic England used to be within the English heritage umbrella, but English heritage is now the sites, properties, the heritage interpretation, the tourism, the charity stuff, the guidebooks, whereas you're the everything else. It can overlap with those sites, can't it? But it's also urban environments,
Yeah.
rural environments. It's about cathedrals, townhouses, that type of in towns as well as lumps and
outside.
bumps
Yeah.
and things outside in the landscape. And
It's dealing with stuff that we call setting, which is, I don't know if it's something you've ever talked about before,
no,
but like the idea that when you're standing in a heritage site, its setting is important to it. So setting might be what it feels like, what it looks like, what can you see. And I think like it's difficult when you have like a below ground Roman villa. It just feels like a field. But if you suddenly enclose that field in just houses, if you suddenly like cut a road through the center of it, you're not going to be able to kind of feel where the archaeology was and understand that there was something here. And with a castle is designed to be, they weren't necessarily defensive, I won't say that, but they're imposing kind of like iconic kind of structures. And if you build like a tower in its sight line and suddenly it's 4 stories bigger than the castle, it swamps the castle's feeling. It makes it seem smaller. It takes away what made it special, what made it unique in this landscape. So it's making sure that you can kind of stand in archaeology sites and understand its setting, its contemporary kind of setting a little bit. Like you can't kind of fix everything, but a little bit give you some idea that this is what it looked like, what it felt like when it was made, like when it was built.
A lot of it's compromise, but it's not only compromise about don't dig there, dig here, don't destroy this bit, destroy a little less of it. It's also about the broader landscape of where these sites are. So that's really important, isn't it? Yes.
Stuff like barrows are always designed to be seen to each other. They weren't designed as standalone monuments. And if we treat them as standalone monuments, we're going to lose that interconnectivity in the landscape. We're going to lose those sight lines. We're going to lose the fact that this was a network of things. This was something broader than itself. Linear earthworks we'll talk about later, the idea that it might be just a bank that goes through the landscape, but actually it's not a corridor. Like the whole point of it was that you can see it from a long way away. It wasn't, they built like an earthwork around like a mine, for instance. It wasn't saying you can't get in here. It was more like if you're over that hill, you can tell there's something important there. And like if you kind of remove that sight line, it reduces that importance. It makes it harder for someone who isn't, hasn't got the eye like we might have to understand how important that monument is. And the idea is, that's what I'm fighting for all the time, is that the general public can understand this heritage, that someone living in Chichester can understand the heritage of Chichester. Someone visiting Canterbury can get a sense of the importance of Canterbury, rather than you have to read a book for it or you have to be in that knowledge. It's letting the public kind of have some ownership over their own heritage. And it's not doesn't just belong to the person who owns the landscape.
Absolutely. And the idea of sites is an arbitrary thing in itself, isn't it? That we always talk about, that certain areas are protected, others not. But I always explain to people, like in the centre of the historic city of Chester, some people say to see the Romans you need to go to, say, the amphitheatre, but a lot of the street lines are either over the exact lines of the Roman defences or the Roman roads, or are just slightly off from it. So there's nothing to see that's Roman, but you're walking in the footsteps or in the legacy of that Roman past. So it's about trying to make people aware of the tangible and the intangible that is of the past that's informing that. I think that's really cool. So
and it's sometimes like like a castle, it's the stone keep isn't really the extent of what the castle was, but maybe now after the Victorians, that's all that's left or something. But if you can find ways to work with city planners to bring out elements of that castle in the way they design roads, in the way they paint roads, in the way they kind of put crossings on, in the way they put signage, you can kind of start bringing that into the kind of cityscape again, and give a bit of wider context for these sites that we just point to as a dot on the map, but actually they were much larger, much more different kind of.
So obviously you rarely can have the power to stop people building, but a lot of it has to do with education, advocacy, compromise, that kind of thing. Is that fair?
Yeah. I think because the legislation for scheduled monuments is so high, people don't tend to try and build in a scheduled monument. That would be very difficult. But you can kind of give them a bit of a steer to not ignore it. I think often with heritage, a lot of planners will be like, well, there's a red line, don't build in that, we'll be fine. And a lot of my conversation would be, have you thought about integrating it a little more? Like, have you thought
Yeah.
about how kind of, if you want to make a green park in your new development, does it have to have a fence line around it here? Because that ruins the feel of it. If you have like a more natural slope into your kind of Greenland, that gives a more natural feel to this landscape and allows the archaeology to survive a little better. So it's that, like, it's not scaring them. And stuff like, I had developments at the base of like hill forts and things like that, and it's not saying that you can't build the development there, but if you thought about reducing the fence lines that you're putting here, because actually the visibility is really important. If you thought about trying to find like an avenue of where you put the houses so you can still see the earthwork from these positions and stuff, and then it's literally just like talking to them and offering, as you say, compromise and offering suggestions. And I think making the archaeology less scary for them to deal with, to realize that there is a way through here. It's not like there's something in the ground that's going to stop the whole project. We'll find a way to kind of let it sing and let it give a benefit to the heritage, to the development as well. Like, heritage benefits your development. It doesn't harm it.
Because the heritage is not a dead thing. It's supposed to be
No.
a part of a living community. Yeah, that's really cool.
It's a definite weird thing to get used to when I used to work in British archaeology. It was watching briefs and digging evaluation trenches and things, and now I'm on the other side of it, really. But it's good because I work with a lot of different types of projects. I deal with like research projects, not just development and stuff. And I always think of my role in a team is really that I can understand how we're going to get through the bureaucracy. Like, I understand the legislation, and I can make sure that we're going to get through this together. Like, we're going to get a good project at the end of this, because I know the ways and the way this works, kind of world. So I'm your advocate a little bit if you manage to get me on side.
Well, it's really important work, but you did, Lena, mention the word linear earthwork. So
I did.
We must. While I would be interested in talking about uniforms and inspecting things forever, maybe we should just briefly discuss, or less briefly discuss, your ongoing doctoral research on Offa's Dyke. So, what can you tell us about that?
I think. To give some background, I said I worked in the HER for Herefordshire, and one of the things I realised when working there was that Offa's Dyke is in Herefordshire. And I didn't know that. I genuinely did not know that when starting, and I don't think everyone does, because it is one section of Offa's Dyke which doesn't exist very well. It doesn't survive very well in the landscape. And I started getting a little bit, I was going to say obsessed there, but I don't want to make myself sound crazy. But I got really intrigued in this kind of monument, in this giant monument. And the more I kind of read about it, the more I looked stuff up, the more I realized is how little we actually know about it.
Yes.
And I always think when something's named, I feel like we know everything about it, but like,
it's Offa's, not yours.
Yeah, it's Offa's Dyke. It's got a name. How much more can we need to talk about this?
Yeah.
But the more I looked into it, it's like we don't know barely anything about it. We don't really know when it was built. We don't really know why it was built, and ultimately, we don't really know where it all is either. So I decided that there's a lot of different things I can do, and one of them is I wanted to do a LiDAR survey of the entire monument. So actually get a database or get some actual data from LiDAR of saying where the dike is and where the dike isn't. What actual route does it take? Where does it exist in the landscape? What does it do in the landscape, and why does it do it?
Yes.
And that's kind of what I started kind of collating and surveying. Is that the briefest rundown?
That is the briefest thing ever, and you have proven conclusively it was built in the year. No, and, no, but it's really interesting that, I mean, I don't want to big up too much one of my own doctoral researchers, but you are doing the first modern mapping of the dike in the landscape, aren't you? You're putting not only where it went, but trying to understand how it went, why it went.
Yeah.
You know, the interaction with the topography, using that LiDAR, which is something no one's used before. Just, drone footage is lovely, and
that's gorgeous.
AP's aerial photograph, sorry, and beautiful vista shots along stretches. It's all wonderful, but and bits have been surveyed, earthwork surveyed, but very, very little. And we've got some good standard mapping, but it's that LiDAR that can bring out. I mean, could you perhaps go over for people who for people who don't understand as much as me about LiDAR? Could you explain what on earth is it? What is LiDAR? Machines that go bing, isn't it? It's something to do with lasers.
It's lasers. It's basically lasers. So it's
tech. That's tech. We've
tech.
done it. We've done the tech.
Yeah.
I'll put a graphic over here. This bit,
just put it up. I don't know how to go to so much detail, but effectively, we're using like an airplane because it's aerial LiDAR. You can do land-based stuff as well, but the stuff the mainly useful stuff for us is used by airplanes. And you fly an airplane over an area and you fire a laser down to the ground, and you record how long it takes for that laser to bounce and come back up again. That's the simplest explanation of LiDAR. And doing that a lot of times, doing that every half meter or every meter or every 2 meter, whatever you can do, you end up building the distance between it takes to get to the plane to the ground. And so if you hit a mountain, it bounces back a lot quicker. And if you hit a ditch, it takes a lot longer. And eventually you can start building up, using those dimes, using those dates, you can build up a model of the topography of the landscape you're dealing with. LiDAR is especially useful for archaeology because it cuts out vegetation, which no other form of aerial survey does. If you take a photography, you still got vegetation. Even drone photography still has vegetation. And especially the Welsh borderlands, so much of the woodland there, so much of areas were kind of 20th century woodland, part of the huge post-war replanting need for lumber and stuff. So it comes really hard when you're on the ground to do any sort of survey to understand the extent of monuments. And suddenly we have this technology where we can strip out of that vegetation, strip out of those trees, strip out of those leaves, and just see a topography of the landscape itself. And through that, we can start making discoveries in the landscape. And it used to be, I have no figure on this. I have no idea. But the amount of sites that I found through LiDAR is ridiculous. You find it all the time. People are always like, archaeologists, why aren't they rewriting the history books all the time? And I'm like, well, I found quite a few castles. Isn't that cool?
Yes, that is blimmin' cool. That is, because, and particularly for Britain, with such a long history of field investigation by amateurs and professionals, you would think that we would be in a position where it's near impossible to find new monuments. That's the point, isn't it? But we're finding them all the time using this new technology.
And the thing is, because on the ground, you wouldn't believe this. Things are hard to see. Yeah. I've stood on monuments and barely been able to see them, and then you look at the LiDAR plot and you're like, oh, is that what it's doing? That's what I can see. I can see the earthwork, bank around there. There was one I was looking at the other day, a part of this survey, and it's been recorded as a ring, a ring fort, a castle ring, and it's one of those descriptions that just says, we don't know what this is. It could be Iron Age. It could be medieval. It could be, I don't know. Who knows? It's a ring. It's a fortified ring. They built them for every point. And I was looking at the LiDAR plot, and there was quite a clear south enclosure to it, like a South Bailey. And I was like, I think this is medieval. You don't tend to get that in Iron Age and earlier features, so it's probably a medieval feature that we're seeing here. That no one, even though this southern enclosure is a footpath, is a part where trees probably grow better or something. It's just not easy to notify this stuff on the ground. It doesn't, until you get the whole picture. It really is difficult to kind of point to something that's much bigger than you and can hide in the landscape and get an idea about what it is. So that's kind of what Offa's Dyke is like. The thing with Offa's Dyke, because it's so big, and I always forget how long it is, so I'm not going to say. But
it's beyond comprehension just how big. It's a landscape feature, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's not, even when you're standing on it, it's hard to get any sort of grasp of how actual big this monument is. And I think there has been a presumption throughout the past 200 years, 100 years of archaeological works that something this big does not get removed from the landscape. There is presumption that like this is a big thing that everyone can see and it survives. And I think we think about that in a lot of archaeology in our landscape, and it's not true. Like, it's just simply not true. And I mean, I've done it, I've got the evidence. There's big stretches of the Dyke that have been ploughed out, that have been subject to erosion, subject to, the Enclosure Act destroyed a lot of things. And it still survives. The LiDAR shows a shadow of a monument, like something that's surviving just as a little bump in the landscape, or something that just exists as like a fill boundary, a slightly weirder big fill boundary or something that is actually at some point would have been the size of the things that we look at in elsewhere. But the human endeavor to remove things and move land is greater than the land's ability to fight back from it.
So the conventional view of Offa's Dyke is it's built by the merchant king Offa against the Welsh in the late 8th century from sea to sea. We have it surviving in places. We have it in Flintshire, Wrexham, Shropshire, Radnorshire, or Powys as you call it, generally. And then you have it in Hereford and Gloucestershire, right? So we have, and there's debates about how long it went and so on. But skipping quickly to what you've been doing, you basically, to be absolutely clear, you have found whole new sections of the monument that people had either guessed but hadn't got evidence for, or people hadn't even imagined were there. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I think it's there's a lot of this has always been speculation, really, without any kind of actual evidence of where things exist. There's been a lot of debate based on, I would say, vibes sometimes of just like, well, it must go here, like it must be this
reckoning. I reckon.
And actually I've been able to kind of pull out the kind of evidence that exists in the landscape for it. There's areas where I was talking about scheduled monuments. There's areas where the Dyke is scheduled, which I've been able to show isn't scheduling the Dyke. It's missed the Dyke, like it's actually at a different point, because these things happened to be put together in sometimes like the 50s, the 60s, where you couldn't do what we're doing now. So they were mapping the incorrect thing. They were mapping the wrong extent, and they never mapped anything that survived below ground. So like the current data we had that really is just the scheduling data just was completely inadequate for anyone wanting to start a study on Offa's Dyke. It felt like every single time you wanted to start a study on Offa's Dyke, you had to make a data set, because just nothing existed. So every single time someone wanted to talk about this monument, you had to start from scratch. And I'm really hoping that's something I can offer to people. Hey, that's a pun. Is actually that
I was going to do one later on, but I thought, no, I won't.
But I wanted to say, like, and now people can use this data to study it. I'm sure people will find new areas or something like that. But at least there's some starting point of what the Dyke is now. At least it looks like something. Until I'd done the mapping of where I think the Dyke is, I'd never seen it depicted in like the way it looks on my screen with 3 segments. Like I'd never really seen that before, because no one had really drawn it like that before, because the data just hadn't been done. And now at least I'm getting a better picture about what it looks like in the landscape. Where was it possibly built? And it's allowed me to then dive down into the nuances. There's the stuff I like to talk about all the time is that I think it's an insecure monument. I feel like, and I feel like
it's a nervous monument.
It's a nervous monument.
Please don't look at me. I'm so shy.
And it's the same way. Like there's a lot of debate around this, and I won't get too much into it. But the way I think humans imbue things with agency, right? So if you have like an artifact, if you have like a little kind of lucky coin or a pebble or something like that, we're giving it more power than it actually is. And I've always been like this work with Offa's Dyke. I've been thinking of it as almost like as an artifact, as like we don't know a lot about this time period. We don't have a lot of like charters. We don't have a lot of like archaeology even, but we do have this giant monument that kind of goes across the landscape. So if this was built with purpose, if it was built with some agency behind it, if it was built with an idea behind it, and if it was built in a world where there were different powers in that landscape vying for this kind of energy and vying for this landscape control, then can we see that actually pictured in the Dyke itself? I didn't know if we would be able to or not. Like, it might be like, no, I can't tell. Like, but I see areas where the Dyke chooses to take what is like a least advantageous route, something that is less visible, something that's going into a dip in the land, and then I get to ask myself, well, why would it go that way? If the whole point of Offa's Dyke is it's trying to be this big, prominent visualization to the west, why would it go in a dip where it can't be seen from anyone? And quite often you can look in the landscape, and I keep finding corresponding monuments which the Dyke isn't going towards. It's kind of avoiding in the landscape. It's turning from it, and we don't have all the evidence yet, but it's likely that that might have been a Powys, a Welsh kingdom strong point, or at least maybe not a strong point, but at least it's been identified as that was in their ownership kind of thing.
So what you're trying to say, well, what you are saying is that when you mean by insecurity, you mean that the monument isn't as commanding as people have claimed it to be. It's like a sort of a colonial proto-English Mercian grandiose state that stretches from Kent at its highest extremity to the Irish Sea, to the Wash, to the Bristol Channel. This kind of grand central English power isn't quite as controlling in this land. It's not, obviously it's trying to make its statement in the landscape. The king and his ealdorman and various others are agents in this landscape, but it's not a landscape they have a handle on. It's not a landscape they're fully in able to control. And the Dyke is perhaps showing that tension between indirectly the agency of the Welsh. Is that maybe what you're saying?
I think that's totally right, and I think we picture Offa a lot like it's the all king of southern England, and writing letters against Charlemagne and stuff, and actually I think what this might represent is a point in his power where he probably needed to do something because he felt insecure about it, or he felt under threat. I think a lot of the writing of the Dyke I was used to was the idea that this was maybe a front for taking Wales. Like, it was a step towards Offa trying to kind of dominate the Welsh, to push back against the Welsh. And I think the way it speaks in the landscape is much more about a security measure. It's much more of an insecure response to something rather than this all-powerful emperor Offa that we picture him as in history, really. And I think it makes sense. I mean, Offa was an insecure guy. He was obsessed with Rome. And I think this part of what I find interesting in history is I think of origin myths as a really interesting thing about the way that we talk about the world, and our origin myths of England are a little bit poorly understood. I think they're so ingrained in our in our world that we don't even know they're myths anymore. And I think Offa he's definitely not in history books because we don't like to pay attention to how complicated England was before the kind of Norman. But I think this idea that he was I am suddenly finding myself the most powerful person in England. What do I do now? How do I treat this? And the only thing he really had to do is look back on previous kind of kingships, previous powers, and what was there was the Romans, really. And I think in a lot of ways what we're seeing in this time period is a struggle to understand how you be a modern king. How do you be an early medieval king? Well, the Romans built big infrastructure projects. The Romans had their power base in Bath, and they minted coins with them depicted as emperors. So we'll do that. That's what a king is, right? That's what a king looks like. That's how I need to be. So
it's like that internet meme recently about how often do men think about their own empire, and it's all about sort of comes down to sort of a fragile masculine, sort of toxic masculine things. And no. I can imagine Offa sitting there going, I think about the Roman Empire literally every 10 minutes,
I think he did. And bearing in mind, you got the time period where at some point someone's becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. Yeah. And I think there is an alternate history that it's Offa's chosen, there is at least he liked to think there was. And I think he was trying to be that. I think he was trying to find that kind of that that power and that image. And I think Offa's Dyke is to do with that. Like he's showing himself as a powerful individual rather than it actually making too much sense in the landscape. No one does this like out of like strategic. There's so many better ways to do it. Like if you were trying to do this, than build this giant monument through like marginal lands and stuff. But I think he does it because he's proving his power, and he hasn't got the ability to kind of marshal his armies anymore because he's spread out throughout the whole country now. He's in Kent, he's in East Anglia, he's fighting against Wessex. He can't just bring the armies back to push against power. So I think it's an that's what I see in the way the monument is built is an insecurity. I think especially when it crosses low lands, it's so direct. Like when it's in the highlands, you get this kind of like gentle kind of meandering almost but going through areas, and as soon as it gets to a low land it just goes so straight like to the next bit and like quick, make it through here, build through here like and then it gets back to the safer territory again. I think it doesn't feel like something that's being built over like through like ownership, a commandment. It doesn't feel like someone who has a total control over the landscape and is wielding that. It feels like someone who's trying to make you think he has total control.
It's always compensating for something, monument building. But it's interesting, isn't it? And this is all work in progress. So I think, with all due respect, I want to let people deliberately hang waiting for the fine-grained results to emerge in due course. But of course, some of your work has been published in the open access Offa's Dyke journal, which people can go and read, and we'll put a link in the description. But that's a really fantastic sort of synopsis of your ongoing work. And we didn't at any point, this is a running joke between us, go into detailed individual farm names or discussions of individual streams in obscure parts of to describe, in our, which is what I'm afraid we joke about this because we end up both me and Lena in the landscape and in conversations end up doing. And of course you'll realise, when it just north of Spode Farm or something, you go, but how else is anyone else going to know that? I think I just wanted to sort of pat ourselves on the back for saying we got through that without descending into discussions of topographical details like that.
I can't name to you the amount of times I've been mapping the Dyke and wanted to kind of give a written description of it, and there's just an unnamed bit of water.
Yes.
Well, what do I call this? Like, what? This has got a name, surely.
Unnamed tributary of the Unk or something like that. No, it's fascinating, and it's a monument that has still got a lot of secrets to be
absolutely
to yield. And I think this lidar work is going to be important. And that leads me to my sort of penultimate question, which is: doing this work, this fine-grained landscape work using this modern lidar technology, does it give you any sense of concern or optimism about the future of landscape archaeology more broadly, or is that too difficult a question? I mean, what do you feel is happening? Is this a watershed moment, to use a topographical metaphor? Is this a moment of change where we're going to, obviously lidar's not brand new, and detailed GIS analysis of landscape is not new, but this is your part of the sort of the generations of scholars who are working with this big data sets, fine-grained landscape resolution. I mean, do you get a sense of optimism out of that?
I do get a sense of optimism. I do. I think what it's doing is allowing us to have conversations that are much like broader than ourselves. I think like it allows us to talk about areas of the land without technically being in it, which has always been a difficulty for archaeology. It's always been a difficulty to look at a patch of ground and to kind of discuss it as a historical kind of timepiece, as like a time depth in it.
Yeah.
And this allows us to get some sort of picture of the actual monuments, some sort of picture of where heritage has been, and start displaying that. I think one of the issues is we always have with archaeologists is showing archaeology to people.
Yes.
And like it's easy to show you, like I'm not a finds archaeologist, like I can't date every bit of pottery I've ever found.
Yeah.
But people know that. You can show them a piece of pottery, you can show them a bead, and they can understand what that is. But if you point to like an earthwork on a hill, it's just so difficult for someone to kind of grasp and understand and like, to be honest. And I think when we start using this technology, if we start being able to kind of harness it, we're starting to be able to bring a bit of life to these monuments that are just so hard to grasp. We literally cannot take every person we know in a helicopter and fly them over a hill fort, but we can
No.
give them a map and start showing them this is the hill fort. And you see that this is the bit you walk through every day, but actually there were 3, 4, 5 areas of ramparts that lead up to this that you can't see on the ground. This is how far down it goes. You can see the ridging on the ground where they farmed. You can see hut circles where there was some occupation. You can see like mounds where there was some industry. You can see quarrying that is 2,000 years old or something in the denser landscape. And I think it starts giving a bit more of a picture to the landscape than just pointing to stuff in the far distance, really, which is the only thing we ever used to be able to do.
I cannot agree more. I mean, in terms of being an educator and taking students in the field to places and going, as you can see the slight right, and they're going, and then I go, I've been trying to do TikToks where I show monuments, amazing Mott and Bailey, and of course just the nature of film, it just looks like it's that here. So it's really difficult to show people this stuff, both in person and via film. So any kind of visualization, so it's everything from the identification and analysis to public engagement at every level. This technology is shifting the gears of
and I think
things.
it's going to eventually like open up conversations about stuff like scheduling, stuff like extensive landscapes and things. We're becoming such I wouldn't say becoming actually, but there is so much development in this country that we are going to be starting damaging archaeology to maybe the same way it was in the 60s or something. And then with this data, we can start having better conversations about how we treat the archaeology, how we work with it, how we engage with it, and how it's used. And I think it can be a really useful tool in being able to kind of be a stakeholder in those kind of conversations, and to start kind of explaining to someone how this can be kind of incorporated, how this can be used, and how we can kind of work with this. So I think it's a tool it's a tool that we can definitely benefit from. Especially when like linear earthworks are so difficult. They're not about the earthwork itself. Like they are a symbol of like power in the landscape. There's something that's been imbued with that kind of power that existed when it was built. And if you just focus on the bump in the ground, you're going to miss the reason why it was built. You're going to miss kind of what it did to the landscape. And I think the LiDAR allows you to kind of pull the camera out a bit and look at this. This is what it would have done to someone at the time. This is why it was built facing this way, because look what impact it has on the west, or look at what impact it has on someone over these hills and things. And I think that's the kind of key here.
It's like the old Wheeler quote about archaeology, without people is the driest dust that blows. It's we're not interested in the lumps and bumps. We're interested in what that tells us about
absolutely
the experience.
Yeah.
When you say power, it's not simply military power. It could be sacral power. It could be the impact, the effect on communities, and it's significance. It's really I think that's a really great way of putting it. And it does lead me to one final question, if I may. If there's time, which is, you are someone who has straddled in your career commercial, governmental, academic, archaeologies. If that doesn't capture everything, just generally being a student. When you were a student, you've been through that route of many different roles and perspectives, and so I've been looking on and contributing to some of the social media debates about how we combat misinformation and disinformation in wider society about the human past. And I'd like your sense, please, of what you think we're doing right, because it's easy to just, immolate ourselves as, we're all rubbish. We've never, ever communicated to the public before, which is what I've just literally heard someone say on a YouTube live stream, or we blame, it's the media, it's the stupid, public who won't listen to the truth. So, those are the two poles apart of approach to this. I just, between those two extremes, I'd love to hear your thoughts on misinformation, disinformation, and what, if anything, we can do about it. Big question, big topic, maybe a whole separate
that's a
discussion,
big question.
But I'd just love some thoughts. Any thoughts?
I think we got to be very careful in archaeology about using the word truth about stuff. And I think as soon as we start saying truth about things, we're running down a bad path here, because human experiences is so subjective in every single way. and personally, I've always been interested in, like, you know, who lived here, what did they do between the year 300 and 600. Like, that's a lot of people, like, falling in love and going to war and walking a distance and building stuff. Like, that's not one narrative. That isn't one person. That isn't one route. That isn't one thing. So I think we got to be very careful about when we're trying to give the idea of truth to someone, because I think that's the way we eliminate the kind of complexity of the past, when the past was a mix of different identities and different people and different worlds, and it wasn't just a single thing that we've decided exists. And I think in terms of, like, pseudo archaeology, I've worked in a lot of different places, a lot of different people. The biggest issue we have, I think, is combating the way people are taught and talk about heritage. I think I'm always been obsessed with, like, origin myths. I say this a lot. Like, I love, like, the way things happen and we decide that's the truth. You know, Alfred united the kingdoms and we became England, and except for the fact this coin shows that he was a twin emperor. Like, so what's the actual truth here? Like, America, I've always been obsessed with American, like, archaeology, because they have very established kind of origin myths about their kind of start, and it starts falling away when you start doing archaeology there, because it doesn't quite make sense. It is a narrative that's been told to us to kind of make the world simpler, and I think we got to kind of impart a little bit more in our education system and in different avenues in the world, that these ideas that were kind of solidified in the Victorian period aren't necessarily the reality of what happened in the past. This idea that it's kind of mad that no one in school will tell you that like, riding a bicycle will make a woman's womb fall out, but we're happy to kind of sit in a history class and tell them about, like, how England conquered the world with a handshake and a flag. Like, and
what, you saying it didn't happen that way?
And I think there's some reason the stems have kind of been able to move a lot quicker in feeding down, like, general way we talk about the kind of research and policy, and the arts, the humanities are very much stuck in the way that it was solidified in that kind of 100 years ago. And I think it's just because when you're taught stuff at a young age, and when the media tells you one thing, to tell someone that that's incorrect kind of damages the idea of what they've always grown up with. So, and I think we do need to kind of start being better at imparting to people the complexity and the variety in the past, and not the, Rome was a one ethnic kind of world, or the Vikings were this, and
people
actually
are hungry for that complexity, in my opinion. They don't need the dumbing down, narratives.
They don't. I think, I think it's got really bad over the past 10 years. I think the way that the politics and the government have forced separate topics into teaching has impacted the way that we think about ourselves as, like, a nation, as a history. And I would love to see us discuss a little bit more about the people that lived here, rather than me focusing entirely on the hierarchy of power, so to speak. And actually the history of this land is the people that lived in it, and not necessarily the person who sat on the throne, and not necessarily the person who had the power. And
less about the monarchs and the queens and the kings and the bishops, and more about the common person. But no, seriously, most people. I mean, like, I think I said the Enclosure Act earlier, but the way the enclosures changed this country, like, way it kind of tackled the workers of this country, and it gave and set this very solidified kind of hierarchy here, is important for us to know. I think it's important for you to grow up and know that this is why we live in the world we live in. But we don't do a good job at imparting that knowledge, not through, like, when I say we don't do a good job of it, not focused to one person individually, but I think our society is built around very simple messaging, which is just not really the truth. This is my general feeling, and I know that I'm in a minority here, is that I think that we're fixating on the most extreme and ridiculous ancient aliens, ancient apocalypse mysteries, which do deserve countering, of course.
Sure.
Whereas I think the more pernicious and difficult myths and mysteries are the ones that center on nation building and ethnic origins, which are people are much more beloved of. And it's easy, it's almost, I don't want to, this will really nut people off, but it feels almost lazy to focus on the perhaps more marginalized or fringe groups that like to believe in rather fantastical paths, because while those are dangerous too, and they are easy targets rather than the more pernicious. It's easier going up to some hippie at Stonehenge going, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. It's easy to do that, but it's not as easy to go up to a local government official or a sitting MP and say that your vision of your entire national story you're peddling is completely unfounded. And I think there's a power differential there that I think perhaps archaeologists have been slow at realizing their that's my rant, sorry.
No, I agree, and I think I think it's easier to point at some like pseudo archaeology thing and say you can see the white supremacy in that, can't you? You can. It's very much more loud and obvious than it is when, I don't know, if you're in the centre of London and you're pointing towards various buildings, and
wonderful architecture that embodies the spirit of Britain and the huge extractive empire of power. And
there's a reason why the entire city of London was able to be rebuilt at a certain time period, and it's worth talking about that. It's worth having that as a message.
Gave their money and time to support the wonderful
materials were cheaper for some reason.
Yes, exactly. But that's the point, isn't it? Is you can't you got to the work of combating this misinformation can't be just to fire shots at the enemy as a defined camp. It's about deconstructing the very foundations of power and narratives of identity that we we are part of our nation. I would have thought. But anyway,
I think so, and I think it's been very. I think it can be very easy in the kind of the world we sit in to look elsewhere and point out what they're doing incorrectly. I think it's very easy to laugh at like America and stuff like that because
I do daily.
The louder people. But I think we pretend that we don't have those issues here. I think we pretend that they're not exactly the same things, and it's nicer to kind of point overseas and go, well, look how they're handling their pseudo archaeology, and actually focus in how we do it in our own country and how we've just solidified some really important topics, and we aren't really combating the way we talk about them or changing the kind of ideas around them.
Couldn't agree more. We need another whole natter about this, but I think
I could go on forever.
we could, and we should. But we've covered masses, huge acres, landscapes of time and topic in this conversation, Lena, and it's been a real joy and a privilege because while there is obviously a sort of not exactly a boss, relationship of supervisor, doctor, researcher, I'm totally aware and very respectful of your vast expertise and your very different career journey, and I think I'm really grateful that you've been able to share some of at least some snippets of that with us for this Archaeodeath interview, and hopefully it'll spark people's thinking in different directions about how many different ways there are to be an archaeologist and to do archaeology.
Absolutely.
So I'm just so grateful for you spending the time, and we'll put anything you want to put in the description so that people can find you or find your publications and other work as you prefer. But for now, I just want to say thanks. It's been great.
No. It's been a delight. Thank you, Howard. And I definitely we're willing to come back sometime. Let's talk about we can talk about archaeology and movies at some point. That'd be fun.
Oh, well, your encyclopedic filmic knowledge, I would. Yeah, we should do that. Well, we'll scheme about that one. But for now, thanks so much. Take care.
Take care. Bye. Thank you.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.